is Palm Sunday, and we're very excited to be here celebrating. And of course, even if we go back historically, even though we know that a week later things turned tragically wrong, Palm Sunday was a great day of celebration. And we celebrate that because Jesus had come down from the Mount of Olives and he came into Jerusalem. There was great jubilation and great joy. Primarily, this is because just a short while earlier, outside of Jerusalem, he had raised someone from the dead, and that gave him great notoriety. And so as he came in, so many of the people, especially the Jewish people, were so excited because they thought that he was the Messiah that had been talked about in the Old Testament. And he was going to come and change the government and elevate the Jewish people to a place of power and great position. And of course, that really wasn't what Christ was about at all. That wasn't what the deal was. It wasn't what was going on with him. Nonetheless, he came in, and as he came in, people were so happy and excited to see him. And we read in the scriptures that they were throwing their garments and people were cutting down palm leaves to pave the road for him, to make the road nice and accessible. And then, of course, we read further in the scriptures that the government, the leadership at that time, became very nervous because, of course, when you're in a place of power, you don't want to have to worry about somebody coming in and robbing that from you. And so we know that between now and Friday, Good Friday, things did turn tragically wrong for Christ. The thing today that I want to talk about, though, is that as we read in the scriptures about all these things that happened, even at the time of great height of jubilation, all the way through the process of his disciples leaving and abandoning him, and this government and in his supposed trial with Pontius Pilate and all these horrible things happening. Through all of it, Christ remains centered. We don't read in the scriptures that, he lost his head and got excited with all the celebration when everybody was celebrating, and through all the trials and tribulations of the disciples leaving him, and all of the things that he went through with the government at the time when they were trying to make sure that he wasn't the one who was going to come and take his power. Through all of this time, he remained absolutely perfectly centered. And in fact, our message affirmation today is, I am centered in God. And we know when we read the scriptures that it was exactly in God that Christ was centered as he walked through all of these challenges, all these tribulations, from the very highest peak of Palm Sunday all the way to the end to what we now call Good Friday, and even through the resurrection. And of course, we all have that option. That's there for us. Just like Cynthia was sharing with us earlier, the power of prayer is always available to us. It's always there. We always have that option to stay centered in God. And of course, that brings us great comfort and great solace. And that's why I was mentioning that I loved Chrissy's story, that in a circumstance or situation where she may before have, gotten very upset and frustrated that, she waited a long time for this appointment and it was a mistake on somebody else's part, and why should she suffer for it? But, she was grounded in our teachings and understood to be centered in God at the time and not get upset and just realize it might just be a momentary setback, and this was something possibly for some reason from God. Who knows? Something better is going to come along, or maybe when you end up signing the papers, there's going to be even better interest rate or better terms. You never know. We don't know. But we do know that the way shower is in control of everything. And all these things we do through God in our lives, that we're always exactly where we're supposed to be, even if we don't understand it at the time. And the wonderful way to get through even these hard times is to remain perfectly centered in God. So as we are going through the process of living our lives, it's important to understand that we walk exactly where Jesus walked every day of our life. His example to us was one of living life day to day. And what was it that set Jesus apart? We know in reading through the scriptures. And, it's interesting because, of course, we have this whole entire faith centered around Christ. We're Christians, we're Christians. And if you read through the scriptures, we know there's a good deal of talk about his first 12 years. There's a lot you can read about the first 12 years of his life. And then we really don't hear much anymore until he's about 30. And by that time, he's begun his ministry, we'll call it, although it wasn't a typical ministry like we are today. A lot of times, people and biblical scholars will look back and think that, we might have been better to have been called Paulians, because it was really Paul who established the church. Christ, as we know, as we read in the scriptures, he just went about his daily life. And whether there was a small group that he talked to or whether a large group had gathered, it wasn't a structured event. It wasn't anything. We don't ever read about Christ going and, renting a forum or a temple or anything for the day. He just went through his life, and he was constantly centered in God in every circumstance, in every situation. And so we know, reading in the scriptures, that it really wasn't until after Jesus left this earth that Paul came in and took his teachings and began to establish what we now have today, these, pretty official churches. And it was Paul who actually would, gather groups, and even understood at the time the whole class structure. So, some groups would be for the wealthier people, and some would be for some of the peasants. And he actually established all of this that we have today. And so it's interesting going back to this reality that as we read through the scriptures, there's very little talk about Jesus. So again, when he's 30, we start reading more about it. And from the time that he was 30 to 33, those years, we read a lot about his ministry and the things that he was doing and the ways that he went through his time on earth. And he was constantly centered in God in every circumstance and every situation. So as you go through your life and your day, and we all have so many trying circumstances and challenges and situations, and even in our happiest times, it's important to always remain centered in God, to be this centered person, because we can be so much more effective when we don't allow ourselves to get caught up in the hype of, over great excitement, or especially the over great lows when bad things happen or when challenges come, when we get a diagnosis that's challenging from the doctor, or we have a financial need, but our checkbook just doesn't look like it's going to cover it at that moment, or when we have challenges in our relationships with our families and loved ones, and unfortunately that happens a lot. In all of those times, we need to remember to go back to that place where we're centered in God in every way, in every day. So as you're going through the week, and this week, of course, we're going to keep in mind, hopefully, these challenges that Christ went through, because we know Friday is Good Friday, and that's when the final tragedy in the life of Christ does come, before we have the resurrection, which that we'll celebrate next Sunday. But this week is when everything sort of goes downhill from this Palm Sunday, when Christ entered Jerusalem, and everybody was so happy and jubilant and so delighted to see him, and he was just the man of the hour. And of course, as this week goes on, we know that as that week went on for him in his life, things became very challenging, and it wasn't a good place to be. And we know also that there could have been times when he could have avoided what was coming. We don't know if he knew. We don't know. We don't read in the scriptures whether he knew for sure that his final end was going to be what was going to happen. But certainly, all along, if he had just wavered, if he had, maybe denounced some things or changed his way of being, he probably could have gotten out of that. The government would have said, well, okay, if you just fold on this, but he was always centered in God. He was constantly centered, and he knew that whatever happened, God was with him, and he would be taken care of. So again, as you're going through this week, and hopefully everybody gets to set aside a little time, ask yourself this question: when you are in the midst of turmoil, frustration, or anxiety, am I centering myself? And actually, am I centering myself in God? Because the more centered we are, the more that we find ourselves in the middle of these challenging, frustrating circumstances or situations, the more we're able to deal with it, and the better we get through it. Because, as we talked about earlier, we're always exactly where we're supposed to be. And of course, the way to deal with the highs and the lows of life, knowing that we really don't have any option about whether we're there or not, is to remain centered in God, to remain attached to God through the power of prayer, through affirmations, and if you even have the time during the week, through some quiet meditation time where you can clear your mind and become more centered with God through the power of meditation. So make sure you ask yourself this question when you are in the midst of the turmoil and frustration and anxiety: am I centering myself? Am I taking that time I need? Am I spending that time in prayer? Am I meditating if I'm able? Am I remembering these positive affirmations that can take me through these challenging times and keep me centered and close to God? So in all circumstances, in all situations, we are in the place where we can be centered with God. So it all starts up here by being centered with God through the most frustrating, challenging, difficult times in our lives, as well as in the good times. Always be centered in God. And just as with Christ, as he went through this week that we're about to go through and the challenges that he had, we know that he went through it with grace and dignity, and he was centered in God the whole time. And then, of course, we know that following his death and his burial, there was, of course, the resurrection. The stone was rolled away, and Christ was resurrected again. And even in that process, he remained centered in God. He remained resolute, and he continued to share the message of God, which is, as we talk about here so much, love and staying in this positive, uplifting place. And the good news is that every experience of our life is preparing us for the ability to overcome pain and suffering, to overcome appearances, overcome the way that we think things are, and see the way that life really is. So often when we're in the midst of some great tragedy or frustration or challenge, we do find ourselves not being centered because we're not seeing things the way they are. Whereas when we remain centered in God, we know that all these things are just outward appearances, that inside we know that we can interpret everything and know that we are loved children of God. We are created to have wonderful, wonderful lives of great abundance, great health, and great happiness. In every experience, we can overcome challenges and obstacles by remaining centered in God, just as Jesus Christ, the way shower, remains centered in God. Here some 2,000 years later, almost, we get to celebrate and understand the wonderful, wonderful teachings of Christ, and we get to use those every day as an example for us to live our lives and live these lives of great happiness and great health and great prosperity. And I'd like to invite you to join me now in prayer. Eternal, loving God, we thank you so much for being with us every day, in every way, in every circumstance, in every situation. We thank you, Lord, for giving us the insight and the courage to always remain centered in you, so that no challenge, no frustration, no odd tidings can keep us down. We know, Lord, that being centered in you takes us to this place of great happiness and great health and great prosperity in all things. We thank you in the name of faith, hope, and love. Amen.